So,
Good morning. So for the record, Michelle Childs, Office of Legislative Counsel, and we're looking at draft 3.1 of an amendment to S278 on comparative negligence. You see, so section 1 on the front page, this is not any different from the last version you saw. The new language is on page 2, subsection B. So you recall the issue at hand is whether or not comparative negligence can be used in cases regarding damages for a negligence claim. And the original said related to sexual assault. And then you had the discussion around how to clearly define sexual assault. Is that, according to the statutory offense that's in Chapter 72 of Title 13, or did you want that to be broader? Senator Hashim had brought up the idea about it being focused on certain types of conduct. We talked about the definition of sexual assault in statute in Title 13 uses the term sexual act, which is fairly narrow. And so you wanted to consider having a broader application in subsection B. And so what I did there is replaced sexual assault with sexual conduct as defined in 13 VSA 2821. That definition is used in the sexual exploitation of children chapter, and it is broader than the definition that's used in Title 13 for sexual act. And so I provided you with a copy of that definition. We do reference that definition in other statutes in Title 13 that are not in the same chapter as where that definition is. So an example is that in the sexual assault chapter, there is the criminal offense of sexual exploitation of someone in the custody of law enforcement, and that uses this definition of sexual conduct and refers back to that Chapter 64 definition. You also use that definition in human trafficking, and you changed that from sexual act to sexual conduct according to 2821 several years ago. And there is a bill in the House right now that House Judiciary is taking testimony on to substitute sexual conduct for sexual act in the statutes with regard to sexual exploitation of someone in the custody of the Department of Corrections, and sexual exploitation of a minor where you have a power dynamic between a minor and someone who is substantially older than them and has a position of power over that minor.
I'm not clear on what G is. And it sounds like it's pornography.
This, right, so this definition.
Should that be there?
For this definition?
For the purposes of this bill?
It's hard. I generally think that it would there would not be any situation where that would apply. You're correct in that it is used in the child sexual abuse materials chapter for in particular, and you added that probably like 3 or 4 years ago. The other statutes that reference this don't make an exception for that. I'm trying to think about like what type of case, I think it just wouldn't be necessarily applicable.
Right.
I wonder about instances of like revenge porn, if it might be applicable in that case. And probably
A civil lawsuit.
yeah, if I'm suing someone because I'm trying to think of how to explain it, but because I broke up with them and then they put this out into the world and
right, but I think you have to go back to like the basis of this is a negligence claim related to that, so it's not
So it's just
going to be, the case isn't going to be a civil case against
an
the
individual.
perpetrator of the sexual offense, right? It's gonna be in a context where someone had a duty and then breached that duty and was negligent,
Okay.
related to that particular offense. So it could be, I'm trying to think, like, say, if you had, someone who, was in the care and control of a minor who had a duty to them. I hate to be going back to the school situation, but let's say that there was a situation where there was a simulation of some of one of these acts or something, and production of abuse materials,
And there have been reports made to
and there
the
have been
school.
reports
school
made to
didn't
the
do anything.
school and things like that, and the school didn't do anything. I think it's hard for me to imagine outside of those types of contexts where this would apply in any way.
So is it your recommendation that even though it might not apply to these cases, that we not exempt?
I can't, I mean, you could take some more testimony, from folks about whether, on that. I could, say sexual conduct as provided in, subdivisions 2A through F. And so it wouldn't apply to G, but those exceptions, are not in the other uses of that one. So,
I think, I asked a question and I'm comfortable with your answer then.
I did run it by
It doesn't-
Celeste at Gravel and her only concern was about whether or not it was clear that this definition wouldn't just apply to minors in the context of using it in this bill, and it does not within the definition itself, and again, it's used elsewhere, and so I wouldn't want to create kind of an exception there or new language there because it's not in the other places.
Gotcha.
Is there any further, yes, Senator Norris and then Senator Bowles.
Yeah, Michelle, from the testimony that I heard from the victim, who not knowing all the particulars of the case, obviously, who appears that he was sodomized, whatever, with an object or whatever else. In looking at the definitions of sexual conduct, I'm not sure, maybe you can point me to the section where it covers that, because most of this is around gratifying or sexual desire, whatever. So this was basically like a hazing incident or something, wasn't it?
Right, so you're saying you don't think that it would fit within the definition of B?
I'm just saying that, put it in there someplace, or show me where it is what I'm saying, yeah. I'm not sure any intrusion, however slight, the closest that come is appealing to, I don't know. Does it cover what the victim was telling us happened at that incident?
Right. I think that's a good point, but if you look at which was originally proposed was sexual assault, which is much more narrow than this, then would not address that particular, unless you use kind of a generic term and you're not looking at the definition of sexual assault. So I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, I just want to make sure it's covered. That's all I'm asking. I don't look at it as something that was trying to receive sexual gratification. It was a hazing incident.
Right, correct.
That's my interpretation of it anyway. That's what I thought was happening.
Senator Bowles.
Yeah, it sort of actually brings me to the point that I was wanting to make. This is more broad than sexual assault. I'm wondering if what makes sense is to use this in this bill and actually come back to this section and look at if it is actually covering everything we want it to cover. in a broader context, because a lot of times sexual assault isn't actually about sexual gratification, it's about power.
Right.
And so I actually wonder if 13 VSA to 2821 needs to be updated.
It's interesting. I don't think, well, he said an open committee, so I don't think there's a problem me sharing down here, but because there's this bill up in House Judiciary about changing sexual act to sexual conduct in the context of sexual exploitation of someone in care and control of DOC or a minor. We had a discussion about all these definitions and how they really could use some updating. So Chair Lalonde has already put in a draft request.
Okay.
For next year, so something that I'll do over the summer is speak with stakeholders and look at, how to kind of true up some of these various definitions, because we do have a definition of sexual conduct in the sexual assault statute that's very different from the one in Chapter 64. Definition of sexual act, things like that. And so I think, the hope is that we can look at those definitions this summer, and that there could be some agreement among the folks who work day in and day out with those definitions, and come up with something that's a little more clear and is reflective of how these cases are going now.
Senators.
Would it be helpful if we just added, we keep sexual conduct as defined in 2821, and then also add and sexual assault after that? Would that cover?
If you look at the definition, it depends on how you're using sexual assault, because I think that as it was originally proposed by advocates, it wasn't tied to the statutory definition of sexual assault. It was just kind of like a term of, I think maybe in general, of what we think of as sexual assault, which would include the behavior that Bob was just talking about. But if you look at the definition that's in statute, it's not as comprehensive. So, but obviously it's applied in those ways. So,
No, I see your point. It is just going back to the question or the concern of, how many specific offenses are we going to list, rather than creating the broader definition of, or including the broader definition of sexual conduct.
Right.
Sometimes I think we overcomplicate stuff. And frankly, this is one where the effort here is to make it broader than the sexual assault statute. And this is one way to get there. I think we're asking good questions about what does this mean, but in the final analysis, we don't want victims to be re-victimized in the civil courts by having their prior behaviors brought to light that would diminish their recovery from the person who is alleged or has committed the assault. So I think I'm comfortable, while I don't see how bestiality comes into it, or how the simulation of conduct would come into it. I'm comfortable with leaving it as broad as possible, in order not to have loopholes that somebody claims like she's not my type.
So
And I
actually,
agree with that, but my only concern was loopholes. From the victim we heard, does this cover it? That's my only concern. I wanted to cover
Believe
it.
it.
Okay, and that's why I was asking Michelle that.
so I just want to correct myself. So looking at the definition of sexual act, and then here is, one of the problems with all of these definitions, not really, I think being adopted over many years prior to when I was here, is that if you look at the definition of sexual act in 3251, it does include any intrusion, however slight, by any part of a person's body or any object into the genital or anal opening of another. And so what I can do there, I think, take care of this, and then I think you're good, is to just add in subsection B, negligence claim relating to a sexual act as defined in 3251 or sexual conduct as defined in 13 VSA 2821. And then you're gonna, it's a little odd that you have to kind of pull both of those in there and then read them together to make sure that you're not, that you're covering it. But I think that's what you have to do with the definitions that you have currently.
That would be good.
Yeah, I like that, and I feel,
Not I wanted to.
Oh, sorry.
Before we jump in.
So one more point, I think actually to Senator Norris's previous point, as I'm reading it, I think that would actually be covered under section F, or Michelle.
Right, I know, I was looking at that, but there's no definition of that, so I would want to
For
look.
sexual purposes.
Oh,
Is that-
right.
is that-
Yeah,
Yeah.
I have to see if there's any case law or anything on that, but I think if you have this reference to the 3251 sexual act definition, then I think you're covered on that.
Are you comfortable with chairs?
I'm good. I didn't want to make a scene.
Oh, no. That's fine.
especially with the knowledge that we're working on updating our,
So
Right,
you're
so,
gonna do two amendments to draft 3.1. The first amendment is to add what you just said.
right,
And the second is to make the effective date on passage.
on passage, right, and I can do that
So,
quickly, so if you
Okay.
still want to vote it this morning.
yeah, I'd like to vote it this morning. Eric is a little bit late. I wanted to talk a little bit about what time do you want to finish that?
Well, I'm gonna do it right now, and then, I'll just have to print it, so I can have it in 10 minutes, if that works.
That works. Why don't I take the 1045 item and raise the age and at least present to all of you. And Ben, if you have a copy of my memo to Eric,
Yes, that should,
you could hand it out to the committees and anybody who's ahead of Chris Minner's testimony, so you know. I've already talked with Chris and the DCF staff about this issue. So we can do that in 10 minutes and kind of, I realize it's not on the agenda, but it's as such, but you could hand those out.
should be right on top.
Okay. What I'm talking about is what we do about raise the age. And after Friday's meeting, and I've been thinking about this, I thought it was quite illuminating about various state employees, what they had to say about raise the age, and that they were supportive, but they just weren't ready for it. And so this is a proposal from me that I worked with Eric over the weekend. I'll sneeze and it's based a little bit on the monthly progress reports that were required to deal with the homeless program that was supposed to go to the Joint Fiscal Committee. I did meet privately with the DCF people about this yesterday, and we'll meet with them this morning at 10:45. I was gonna present this then, but since we have about 10 minutes for Michelle to
I
redraft.
already sent it to the copy room, so.
Okay, I thought I'd go over this now with you all, so that you're prepared to ask questions or do whatever you like. So what I tried to do was establish benchmarks that they would have to report on. And establishing a crisis stabilization program, I meant for mental health, by the way, number 5. And the developmental disabilities that we heard about. And number 7 really is for 18 and 19-year-olds transition to adulthood. And this gives them 9 months from the beginning of this fiscal year to raise the age. They have all said they're committed to raising the age, and I think this calls their attention. Now, I'm not, ownership of these 7 items is not the be all end all. We certainly can add to, subtract, or have a discussion about what the benchmark should be, but I was surprised, shouldn't have been surprised, because I've heard that a lot of kids with developmental disabilities are ending up in DCF custody, and that's not acceptable. And I've also heard of when I mentioned crisis stabilization, that's for mental health kids who are, we heard from the workers how difficult it is to deal with some of those kids. And how long it takes to get the help that they need. So anyhow, that's my attempt to.
Looks good to me.
Thank you.
I know we're in a hurry to raise, well, not in a hurry, it's been delayed, but we want ultimate goals to get to that point, but in listening to the employees who work there, I have a concern there too. And benchmarks have been established. I don't think anybody should be coming back. If in fact, we're all here next time, asking to extend the age once again. So I think this is a vote for DCF employees more so than that's what I'm looking at.
Definitely appreciate the benchmarks. I do wonder if it makes sense for them to get started with these monthly reports right away, rather than waiting until July.
Yeah, it's not a bad idea.
And of course, you know, April 1st is certainly better than June 1st, so I would prefer January 1st, 2025.
Well, yeah, I figured it would give the Justice Oversight Committee and maybe the other committees an opportunity to weigh in on whether or not this has been met, this hasn't been met, but particularly the Justice Oversight Committee could recommend certain things, changes in legislation or whatever. There's, like, for one issue is the 19-year-old who's charged with a Big 12 offense is now treated as a juvenile and can't be housed in a correctional facility, even though an 18 or 19-year-old can be held. And so do they have to go into the correctional facility and be held with sight and sound separation? And for many of them, that they would prefer to be in the general population. So,
Yeah, no, I
dealing
certainly,
with stuff like that might come in January. Gives the legislature time to deal with anything that comes up. So that's why I did April 1st. But I appreciate your thoughts. Yeah.
So, just to summarize, this would delay it for 3 months, and then they would have to provide a report on all these points.
Delayed for 9 months.
9 months, okay.
Because it's supposed to, if we do nothing, it goes into effect on July 1st.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. I was confused for a second time. And so my other question is, you know, with with the reporting, I mean, if they come back and say, we're not making progress, this is just a hypothetical, but come back and they say, we're not making progress on any of these points, please delay again, or, you know, we're not able to do it, you know, what would happen then?
I hate to say cross that bridge when we get to it, but it's, I think, if I know, you know, I've served on justice oversight since its inception, and I don't think justice oversight would accept that type of, I doubt they would. And I think that they would probably feel like, you know, if they said, well, we can't do, promoting opportunities for services for children with developmental disabilities, Dale won't cooperate. That'd be one thing. But if they said, no, we can't do any of this, and we want another 6 months, I can't imagine the Justice Oversight Committee saying, okay. But I can imagine the Justice Oversight Committee saying, we've got to deal with the problem in January, maybe a budget adjustment of what to do with the children who have developmental disabilities, who are being put into the DCF system rather than the Dale system. And why is that? And what's the impact? Those, you know, we heard from the workers, they're not trained to deal with this group, nor are the programs that, like Depot Street, where the kids end up. They're just not trained for that. It's a whole different population that sometimes acts out violently, but more often than not is actually exploited by other youth. Particularly troubled youth who, by definition, are in these programs. So I think that's one area. I would hate to have them come back and say in budget adjustment, we haven't put any more money into barge, the diversion program.
Yeah,
Because to make the 18 and 19-year-olds work, they're gonna have to put more money into diversion.
yeah, and I'm just thinking about the conversation we had last time, about, you know, the requests for funding for different programs and whether or not those requests will be made. And, you know, our ability to tell them whether or not they can make those requests or that they should make those requests. So it's just, it's an interesting cross-branch conversation with this.
You know, yeah, actually yesterday in appropriations, there was that kind of conversation without aggression that Director of Finance and Management, because they've taken roughly $29 million in ongoing expenses and put them into the use one-time money for them, which and Senator Kitchell asked Adam if he was going to be there next year to deal with this problem. It obviously creates a problem, and he was emphatic that we may have to go back to what are the core functions of government. Public safety is one of them. And so funding the judiciary, funding the DCF, funding corrections and state's attorneys and so forth is paramount. So I thought we can wait, obviously have a conversation with Chris Winters scheduled for 10:45. And I did, as I said, I did present this to a rough draft of this to them yesterday. And they were actually very happy.
Well, from their perspective, it sure is better than no, do it now.
Yeah. Well, but I think that, Chris said, well, we don't need any more reports, but this is one we can do. So, yeah, I think they were pleased to get this proposal, and I think it's really the workers who, for me anyway, outline clearly what the problem is. All right, so we can switch from raise the age to sexual assault.
Okay, so, for the record, Michelle Childs, Office of Legislative Counsel, and y'all should have draft 4.1. If you do vote it, I would just like to send it through editing after the vote, and then I'll get a clean copy to Ben and to whoever is going to be the reporter. So the new language, you'll see at the bottom of page 1 starts on subsection B, prohibiting the defense of comparative negligence and an action for negligence claim relating to, and you'll see the new language starting on line 1 on page 2, a sexual act as defined in your criminal title in section 3251, or sexual conduct as defined in 2821. And then there's the effective on passage instead of on July 1st. And then I also tweaked the new title to reflect the new edition of sexual act.
Is there a motion to report favorably as 278 as seen in draft 4.1?
So moved.
Senator Bahowski has moved that we report favorably as amended draft 4.1. That's 278. Is there any further discussion? Anybody in the audience should be welcome to. All right. Ben, would you please call the roll, and we can get Senator Baruch's vote once you have
I
it.
just texted him to see if he was available.
You had a question?
I said, no, I just texted Senator Baruch to see if he was available.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, go ahead. We'll catch you.
Senator Norris,
Yes.
Senator Walowski,
Yes.
Senator Chi,
Yes.
and Senator Sears.
Yes. Pending Senator Bruce's vote. Senator Bahowski, would you like to report this?
I would.
Great. So just to check with Senator Baruch, and otherwise it's 401 at this point, and Michelle's gonna get you
I'll send that to both
the real
Tanya
copy.
and Ben.
Edited
And just
copy.
send it to the editors, shouldn't take them long. And thanks, and great teamwork, you guys.
Thank you.
Good job.
Yeah.
Thank you. Now we have, Eric's gonna be a few minutes late. Said he'd be here by 9:35, so why don't, yeah, that's two.
There he is. Perfect timing.
Would you put this letter in my file? Part 1. I think I'm reporting that
Thank you, Michelle.
on next Tuesday.
Yep, I will put that.
Senator Bowles?
What? Oh, no. Thank you.
Bill's right here.
Morning, Eric.
Eric, you're.
Good.
There's a new draft of S209 on the top of all of your files.
One, 209. All right. What do we got, Eric?
I'm just recalibrating myself. There was just in House of Probes. So, what have we got here? I said yes. I was repeating your question, Senator Sears. What have we got here?
I don't know.
We have Eric Fitzpatrick with the Office of Legislative Counsel here to speak with the committee and walk them through a new proposed committee amendment for S209. It should be version 3.1. Does everyone have
Yep.
3.1?
I have 3.1 at 209.
Excellent. Well, that is the latest version. We can take a look at it, particularly note any changes between this version and the last version. There's no highlighting in this one, since I realized that we needed one that was proofed and that the committee may end up voting on today. you'll see that the short title, for example, on page 1 is now embedded in the new chapter on unserialized firearms and unserialized firearms frames and receivers. As well, you'll see a new definition on page 3, line 7. This is the violent crime definition that currently exists in the Vermont firearms chapter. Remember, that had to do with people who are prohibited from possessing firearms, people who have been convicted of violent crimes. So the reason that the new term, and I see already there's a missing, although maybe not in your version, there's a missing quotation mark on line 7. So the reason for that is that you remember, so the general provision of this bill are the prohibition on possession of frames and receivers unless they have serial numbers. So again, it's not a prohibition on someone making their own firearm, but it's a requirement that if they do, they have to put a serial number. So that's the main
If they've
thrust of the
actually
bill.
finished,
Correct.
and that's clear in the bill, they have to finish. In other words, if they just have the frame, 3D printer prints out the frame, then you need to put things into the 3D printer.
Well,
I mean, into the frame.
it says that,
No, the frame counts.
yeah, the unfinished frame is what's prohibited without the
Yeah.
serial number.
There are other parts that if they have not reached the point where they may be readily converted, then you're right, you would need to put put a serial number on it, yeah. And that readily converted language as well, that's not new in the sense that that existing definition of firearm that's in the statute that I mentioned on the people who are prohibited from possessing firearms because they've been convicted of violent crimes, that definition of firearm, which has been used many times since that was passed, which I think was 2015, includes frames and receivers. So
The only thing I'm concerned with is to make sure, because sometimes I start projects and don't complete them. And I don't want to have started a project and I haven't completed it. At what point do I have to get it serialized? That's, I guess, I want to make sure we're not going to have an unintended consequence. Somebody who, started the project and then didn't finish it.
right, I think that turns on the language on page 3, line 3, when it may readily be completed, assembled, or converted to be used as a frame or receiver of a functional
Yeah,
firearm.
so it's ready to go, you just have to put the parts in.
Exactly.
But it isn't just having.
Right, and one thing, just in terms of interpretation, I don't know that this would be the case. I know that if I were an attorney who was involved in a case that involved that definition, I would look to the ATF definitions, which specifically list some criteria to be considered for the way it may readily be completed, and that also other court decisions have looked at that over the years. So
The key phrase is readily complete.
yes, or converted. Completed, assembled, or converted, I believe it is. But I think also, I'll double check on this, but I'm pretty sure that also is not entirely new. That's been in the Vermont statute since 2015, in the definition of firearm.
Okay.
Now, again, that didn't deal with serial numbers. Yeah, it's a definition, but the concept was there.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking of all the things I never completed.
We all have,
that problem too.
yeah, we all have a long list.
Well, when my son moved into the basement, he threw a bunch of stuff away because I never completed it.
But just think about all the things you have completed.
Yes, I have completed a lot of things, but there's a lot of things I haven't completed. And one of the things he threw away was the screen to the front, to the back door. Oh my God. That was completed. Anyhow, such is life. All right, I don't, if you want to continue to go through, Eric.
Yeah, sure. I think you're right, Senator Sears, that honing on, so that's the essence of the crime, page 3, line 11. You can't possess an unfinished frame or receiver. And then we were just looking at, well, what's an unfinished frame or receiver? That was also on page 3, excuse me, turns on that phrase that we were talking about, readily be completed, assembled, or converted. There haven't been any changes to these substantive offenses. They are still as they were in the bill as introduced, other than the page 5, lines 5 through 7. And this is the use, remember, this is the decision the committee made to criminalize using an unserialized firearm while committing a violent crime. So that's lines 5 through 7, page 5. So that's a separate offense. That's a separate 5-year felony, the same 5-year felony that exists under current law for carrying a firearm while committing a felony. So this tracks it to violent crime, and it must be using. Remember, you went over that language as well, not just carrying, but actually using. The next section.
Actually,
sorry, go ahead.
just as a note,
Yeah.
assuming that somebody other than me reports this bill, we should make copies of your little carrying, etc.
Oh, the little chart,
It's gonna come up in 3 bills
right?
if all is successful, so that everybody understands what we're doing.
Yeah, I can send that to Ben, so you can make
Yeah,
copies.
you could.
Yeah.
We need to get, I don't know, this is the first bill, so we need to get 35 copies of it, and so that everybody is aware of what we're doing in these 3 bills.
Yeah, yep. I'll do that, definitely. Before we move to the next section, which is about the ability of FFLs, federal firearm licensees, to imprint serial numbers, one thing I thought of that you may or may not want to include in the section that you just finished, section 4083, I noticed that there, and in some of the firearms provisions, other statutes, there are exceptions for a Vermont law enforcement officer using something for the purpose of, law enforcement purposes. And it occurred to me, I just wasn't sure whether that's something.
Yeah, we've carved that out in almost every bill we've
Yeah.
ever done, so I would be in favor of that.
Okay.
Making it clear that it's their official duties.
Yes, we use that, we have some boilerplate we
Yeah.
use for that. So if you wanted to include that, that would go on page 3. There's already a list of 2 exceptions, 2A and B. This subsection does not apply to A, licensees acting within the scope of their license, or the temporary possession. That means if you're bringing one in to get serialized, you might want to add to that a law enforcement officer acting, the language uses, for law enforcement purposes.
Yeah.
Why would a law enforcement officer need an unserialized firearm for law enforcement purposes?
I mean, you can have situations where you're doing an investigation into these serial numbers, and so if you're these firearms, if you're handling these firearms, carrying them around, if you're undercover, sting operations, things like that.
Or if they're in the evidence room.
Yeah, I thought that. What if you seized one that was illegal? I don't think that would happen, but technically speaking, you
But
might
you
want to
bring
be
them out of
clear.
the evidence room to show a state senator.
Right.
Okay, I am convinced.
All right. Well, I'll add that one.
That was Senator Camping, by the way. I'd already seen him.
He went down to see a ghost gun?
No, he and I went to see the sheriff. We tried to meet with law enforcement for other recruiting down there. And he and I met the sheriff, and I mentioned ghost guns, and the sheriff said, "Oh, I've got one of those." And they, surprisingly, they got them from some teenagers in Dorset who made them look
Great. Just what we need.
Yep.
anyhow.
Dorset, hotspot.
I need to find a 3D printer, actually. Maybe these teenagers will
Well-
print me not a gun.
Yeah,
Yeah.
No, I need a,
I guess I was talking to somebody, evidently they teach that in many of the vote centers how to use 3D printers, not necessarily make guns. Anyhow, so we're at 4084 on page 5.
Yes.
110.
Yep. And this is the section that permits FFLs, firearms licensees, persons who sell firearms as part of their business, that allows them to print serial numbers on unserialized firearms or frames or receivers or components. There's already a federal process for this, but this creates one in state law so that that the imprinting can be done by a local FFL. You'll see that it's a may, so that's line 10, page 5. It doesn't require them to do that, but they may do that if they choose. You'll see a couple of pieces have been added here. If you look over on page 6, line 7, I think after testimony, the
Mr.
committee.
Carroll.
Yep, exactly. Committee wanted to make sure that a licensee who did choose to do this wouldn't be deemed a manufacturer solely for doing this.
And this is permissive language about whether they do it. They may do it.
Correct, exactly. Yeah. Also new on page 6 is lines 15 through 17, that last sentence. This, remember, the process that this sets up is that if the licensee serializes a component for somebody, they bring it in, they put the serial number on it. Before they transfer it back, that they have to conduct a background check. So that's viewed as a transfer that's subject to the background check law. If the person fails the background check, or the committee has discussed it, what if they fail? What if something comes up on their criminal record or their mental health record? It means they're not supposed to be a person who can possess a firearm. Then the licensee delivers the firearm or the component to a law enforcement agency. I think this was also in response to Mr. Carroll's testimony, the last sentence, that they wanted to have some proof that the firearm had actually been given to the LEA, and so that's what this last sentence does.
Mm-hmm.
So that there's a receipt that's required. The agency provides the licensee with a receipt on agency letterhead for the firearm or the component.
I have 2 questions. One is very simple, and that is this bill appears to be missing an effective date.
I was just thinking that same thing. Thank you for noticing that. It does.
I can fill it in for you.
Okay.
Yes, and I believe the committee settled on December 31st. Is that right? Obviously, as much as the idea was to give some amount of time for people to get their components serialized so that they're not immediately illegal. So there's sort of a gap so that they can get it done. So that's up to you for however much you think is a good idea.
6-month period, because it would be from,
Say, let's assume it's July 1st effective date.
Yeah.
Could be sooner, but we don't know. But yeah, that would be 6 months after that through December 31st.
okay,
But again, totally, it doesn't have to be that date, whatever the committee thinks is appropriate.
I'm fine with
makes sense.
December 31st.
My other question is back on page 6, line 9. So I understand as I read that a licensee shall not be deemed a firearms manufacturer solely for serializing means that they are not going to fall under that higher requirement that a gunsmith does. But does this prevent the FFL from becoming the manufacturer of that weapon? Because what I heard the concern was is if we do this, then we are the manufacturer of this weapon and we're liable, could be liable. So I approve of line 9. I'm just not entirely sure it meets the entire concern we heard from Mr. Perro. Does that make sense? I guess I'm asking your opinion, or.
It seems to, we'll probably want to know for sure whether, but it seems to, based on what I recollect him saying.
Okay.
And the word solely differentiates it from if they did manufacture a weapon, they would be the manufacturer.
Yes.
But solely for serializing, they're not.
Yeah, I guess the question is, so like when I read a firearms manufacturer, what I'm reading that to mean is globally, they're not considered a firearms manufacturer.
Solely.
But they still might be considered the manufacturer of that weapon. Do you see what I'm saying? Or am I just, no?
I don't get a distinction there.
Okay.
Also, the pursuant to this section, I think, narrows it as well. So it's only this, not general serialization.
Yeah.
Serialization pursuant to this section. In other words, only in response to somebody bringing it in pursuant to the authority that's granted the FFL under this section.
So I have a different, completely piddling question. So at the end of this, you have the title of the bill is amended to read, and then you list in quotes, the title of the bill, but there's no period.
Right.
And everything in me rebels against the idea of a sentence without a period. Is that just standard?
It is.
Because it's a title,
I could
so
bring
the
that.
title won't have a period.
Right, but the quotes mark off the title, then you would have the period after the quote, but I'm not a lawyer, so maybe,
But you are an English teacher.
I am an English teacher.
Is the
Yes.
deal breaker for you for this bill?
I'm on the fence now.
I think it might be something for the Senate Secretary. I think that's where someone.
No, I've seen it before, it's just it always
I know
bothers
you
me.
always notice it, right? Where's the period? Yes.
I'm gonna focus on D for a second on line 20, page 6.
Page what? Senator Sears, sorry.
Page 6,
Okay.
line 20D, that's just the penalty section. I don't remember, it's probably in the original draft.
Right.
And I'm not sure I wanna have prison sentence hanging over the FLL. I was gonna suggest that we change it to a $2,500 fine.
For a first offense?
No, it's a licensee who violates section B or C of this section shall be
Right.
imprisoned not more
But I mean, if we get rid of the imprisonment and it's a $2,500 fine and the person is caught, then if they're caught a second time, it would still be a
If you do the second time, it's fine for me.
That's what I'm doing.
Yeah,
And have this, the imprisonment for the second offense, first offense, 2,500?
second offense,
I'm okay with that.
1 year and 2,500.
Yeah,
I mean, I can see a mistake being made.
sure. And we're not,
And it might, discourage FLLs from doing it. So,
yeah.
I have a question that's not necessarily, it's kind of about this section. So a federally, like, a licensee, if they violate these types of laws, can they lose their license?
I would think at the federal level, they could.
Okay,
well, if it came back, for example, as, denied, and they gave it back to the individual.
okay. Yeah, that was just, I wasn't sure what that process looked like. I know, for example, if I violate the ethics of my license,
Right.
I lose my license.
Yeah. No, and I think it would be good to check, but hard to see how that couldn't result in you losing your license.
I want to make, give Eric time to make these changes. Are there other changes? Because we could take a break. We're going to schedule for a break at 10:30, but we can take a break. Give Eric a chance to make the changes and come back and vote on the final. So are there any other changes that are contemplated?
Not for me.
So it's just changing the penalty in page 6 and the effective date.
And that's up to 2,500.
Yeah.
You gonna vote on us before 10:15 or have to leave it?
I don't know how long it'll take Eric. I mean, we could take till 10:30 and come back at 10:30 if you'd be here.
I have no idea at 10:30.
Well, how
We do it
long will
before.
it take to talk to those school kids?
They may have a lot of questions,
Senator.
Senator Sears. There's a whole class of civics. And
They
there's
don't-
myself, Senator Brock, a handful
They
of
don't stay on
legislators.
topic, those kids.
They don't either. So I don't know.
How long do you think?
It won't take long, maybe 10, 15.
Well,
I know.
then
I
maybe
said
we
the
can
same.
take a 10-minute break and come back at 10 after. Give Senator Norris a chance to vote, then he can go up and get grilled by Missisquoi Union's students.
Missisquoi.
The Thunderbirds.
The Thunderbird, yeah.
So
Can we say that?
I don't know if that's still their name.
the Red Sox signed a pitcher who's from Australia, and he said he'll do well in Boston because Australians don't use the R's either, so. So if I jumbled Missisquoi, apologize to them.
What was the one that, we're on still, Arnold Schwarzenegger, they made a commercial during the Super Bowl there, Naboth.
I've gotta say,
They've
I
lived
lived in
without one.
Australia
They've run
and in
without.
Boston, and those accents sound nothing alike.
No.
So we get to, stop the line.